Attention.
Hello everyone, my name is Margarete Nasir. I am a Colloquium 205 student and my project is entitled The Syrian Civil War, Steps to Peace. Real quick before we go forward, this is actually, most of you have probably heard of the Civil War by now, especially what with the chemical attack last August. And this is a photo from November 29th of 2012. It's a street in Aleppo, which is the largest city in Syria. It had just been bombarded a week earlier with an air raid. So, just to kind of put that in perspective for you, that's really what you're seeing in almost every city, no matter what street you go down right now. I can't do that. Let's try that. All right, definition of terms. This is a little bit important before we go on because I found in my project that as you're talking about the Arab Spring, which we'll define here, it's important to know what sort of conflicts we're dealing with. And so the Arab Spring is basically, it was a series of uprisings that started in Tunisia in 2010, which led to the revolution in Tunisia, change in government. It has since spread to over 15 states in the Middle East. A civil war is a war between political factions or regions within the same country, which is what Syria is going through right now. Coercive diplomacy, as defined by Dr. Paul Lenz up at NAU, who was the professor who I did my data research with. I interviewed him. He defined coercive diplomacy as a threat of force to get the opponent to do something. That's basically what America did with Syria when they said that they would be crossing a red line if chemical weapons were used, and they would face intervention at that point. A conflict is to come into collision or disagreement, be contradictory. You all know what a conflict is. If you're having a conflict with your roommate, you have a problem. Coup d'etat, which we're going to call a coup at this point because it's shorter than usually what they're called, as a sudden and decisive action in politics, especially regarding a change in government or legally by force. I swear I'm not going to read off the PowerPoint for the rest of this. I just need to for this. A crisis is a condition of instability or danger, social, economic, political, international affairs leading to decisive change. And lastly, revolution is the overthrow or repudiation and the thorough replacement of an established government. So that's basically a revolution is what we're looking at hopefully happening in Syria at some point. But right now, they're in a civil war. When the Arab Spring first came to Syria in March of 2011, they were facing a conflict. It developed into a crisis, now it's a civil war. What happened in Egypt, they thought it was a revolution when the Muslim Brotherhood took over from Mohammed Morsi. When Mohammed Morsi was ousted, however, it's not a revolution because obviously the Muslim Brotherhood has since been overthrown as well. So really that was a coup. So just putting it in perspective. Going on, so this is Syria. Again, I'm sure you all know where it is at this point, but last, May it was an issue. Syria is this tiny little red spot, or orange spot, I know my colors, in the Middle East. That's Syria. This is the enlarged map. When you're looking at Syria, it's a little bit important to notice that all of the towns and major roadways, they're all along near the water side, Lebanon and Israel. So here is Tartus, and it's important to know where Tartus is because Tartus is the only Russian naval port in the Middle East. So that's one of their main reasons for siding so strongly with the Syrian regime, in addition to the fact that they have communist ties in Syria as well. They tried communism for a while, but it didn't work. So the rest of this is basically all desert right here. So kind of goes into the fact that they are primarily an agricultural community. Okay, so history of occupation. Syria has a long history of occupation, but we're only going to go back as far as 1918. Just after, in 1918, Britain and the Arab troops gained control of Syria from the Ottoman Empire, from the French. And at that point, this is the flag that flew. This is the flag of the French occupation in Syria. Just keep that in mind as we go through this. In 1946, following World War II, Syria became an independent state through a series of coups. In 1970, between 1946 and 1970, there were many different leaders. There were a variety and many different people. But it's relatively unimportant when we're talking about the civil war. So skipping ahead to 1970, when Hafez al-Assad became president, it was through another series of bloodless coups this time. He remained president for 30 years until the year 2000 when he died. When he died in 2000, you had to be 35 in order to run for presidency. The age was lowered to 32, which was actually the age of Bashar al-Assad, who was his son at the time. And he was the only one on the ballot, and amazingly, he was elected with 95% of the vote. So that was wonderful. So he's been president now since then, and The Syrian crisis began, well, it was then a crisis in 2011. It was 2 years ago, so 2.5 years ago. This here is the flag of the Syrian state currently. It is also the flag known to be for the Assad family, because that's when it was implemented. The flag that flew during the French occupation is also the flag that the Syrian opposition, the people who are opposed to the government, the Free Syrian Army, are currently using. So it's interesting to note that, while they were occupied before they were an independent state, it's apparently better than what they're going through now. So, or at least in the eyes of the opposition. So, religious and economic makeup of the state. Okay, sorry, this is numbers. Obviously it's important a little bit to know which kind of culture you're looking at, and when you're looking at Syria, obviously it's in the middle of the Middle East. It's smack dab in the center of Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey. It's 65% Sunni Muslim. So before you think it's a completely Sunni Muslim state, remember that it's in the middle of everything else, and the majority of Islam is actually Sunni. 75% of all Islam, or all Muslims are Sunni Muslim. So 65% in Syria. In addition to that, there are 12% of Syrians who are Alawi. Alawi is a small apostate sect of Shiite Muslim. It's actually the religion of the Assad family and of the Syrian government, because what you have to recognize is that it is an authoritarian state. And so when you're looking at Syria, what you're really seeing is the Ba'ath Party. It's a unilateral state. The Ba'ath Party is primarily Alawi. And so the majority of the Alawis actually live in Damascus, which is the capital right here, and in the nearby suburbs. So that's interesting to know. So Christians make up about 10% of the population. The Christians are mostly in the north, near where the Kurds are, and actually the Kurd minority group is right up here, mostly. There's a board there. And they're actually Syriac Orthodox, so it's part of the eastern rite of the church. So when you're looking at the diversity as far as ethnicity goes, in Syria there are many minorities. The majority are actually Syrian by descent and Arab. But the non-Arab descent is Armenian, Turkmen, Circassian, Palestinians, and Kurds. The reason there are so many minorities in Syria is because, at least prior to the civil war, and even currently still in the civil war, it's a relatively safe state for refugees. So for instance, after the occupation of Palestine, many of those people went to Syria. And while it's a small minority, they're respected in Syria, and the Assad family and the Alawi and the Ba'ath Party actually give them, their rights. It's almost like a dual citizenship. They're still Palestinian, but they're given all the rights of Syrians. So it's interesting to note. Their economy, like I said, is mostly agriculture, but it's also industrial manufacturing. And prior to the Civil War, there was tourism, because Damascus is the oldest city in the world. So, obviously people are going to come. So next up, this map is super cool, and I love this map. However, there are two corrections that I need to make to it. Egypt did not have a revolution, as the map points out. At the time when this map was made, they had thought that it was a revolution, but that was before the ousting of the Muslim Brotherhood and before they realized that there was no actual constitution change. Furthermore, in Syria, obviously, it's no longer a sustained civil disorder and governmental changes issue. It's a full-blown civil war. But this map is really neat to note where the Arab Spring came from, which is Tunisia, and all the places it's gone to. I need to point out, part of the reason it was able to travel so fast, we need to keep in mind that what happened in Tunisia in 2010, in December, spread to Egypt within a month. In January 2011, Egypt was already breaking out in protests and riots. The reason for that was because what you saw were people in crowds, and you can even Google it, you see all these people in crowds, and they've got they're protesting, but what they're doing is they're videotaping it with their cell phone cameras, and they're uploading it to YouTube. And that spreads ideas like wildfire. And so what you saw in Egypt, in fact, and just that I know of certainly, there were 3 internet and power shutdowns because the government, when people are uploading these videos and they're spreading ideas, and it's making the situation worse. And so to protect the people and stop the chaos, they actually shut the internet down 3 times. One time it even lasted up to 3 days. Not up to 3 days. It did last 3 days before people started rioting in the squares and there were injuries and they needed to turn the internet back on. So, but again, it's spread throughout the entire Middle East. So. This is a video of it's a tank footage from Syria. And I'm only going to have you guys watch a minute of it's a 5-minute video. But if you've never seen a tank go off before, it's a really eye-opening experience, even though it's only through YouTube. Again, these are soldiers, regardless of which side they're on, who have taken their cell phone cameras and they're videotaping themselves bombing buildings. This is in Daraa, which is actually they'll tell you about it, it's a pretty large city in Syria, and it's interesting to watch. It should be noted that in the video he talks about how Aleppo, I believe he says something like Aleppo is, or excuse me, not Aleppo, Daraa is to Damascus as, Bath, I think, is to London. When he's talking, whichever the quote is, whichever the cities are, when he's talking about Bath, keep in mind the city of Bath is 84,000 people. So that's about the size of the city. So, I really hope the sound works.
The number of refugees fleeing the civil war in Syria could reach 3 million by the end of this year, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency. The warning came as extraordinary footage from the town of Daraa, close to the capital Damascus, emerged. It was shot by cameras placed on top of Syrian government tanks as they bombard rebel positions. Porrick O'Brien reports.
Welcome to Daraa. What Croydon is to London, Daraa is to Damascus, about 10 miles to the south. Its population used to be about the same as a city like Bath. Daraa, it means the place of houses or homes.
So what you're really looking at, and I got the names wrong obviously, but what you're really looking at in that video, and you even noticed it when they're firing at the buildings. They're not firing at opponent troops. They're not firing at opponent tanks. They're firing at houses. They're firing at civilians. They're firing at people. And it's not just the government forces that are doing it. It is the opposition as well. So that needs to be noted that the sides aren't clear, and that's part of why there's been so much controversy over potential intervention. So, in talking about this slide, Antonio Guterres, who is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, stated recently that we have not seen a refugee outflow escalate at such a frightening rate since the Rwandan genocide over 20 years ago. Most people in this room were probably born around the time that was happening and would remember it. So, I'll tell you a little bit about it. Rwandan genocide. It was in 1994. It was an ethnic conflict between the Hutu and Tutsi Rwandan people, and the Hutu decided that for whatever reason that they weren't going to put up with the Tutsis anymore, and over 800,000 people were killed, and by the end of the war there were 2 million refugees who left after the fighting, let alone those who left during it. So the fact that they're comparing Syria to Rwanda is significant. This is the second largest refugee camp in the world. It's in Jordan. And you can see, this is about the size of Phoenix. It's incredible to look at, because when you look at refugee photos, what you're really seeing are communities. And even in the research that I have been doing recently, I see that they've got, they're selling food, they're selling services, they're selling clothing, they're selling all sorts of things. And it's really interesting because they really are their communities. And for instance, in this particular camp, there's a Taekwondo class that some Koreans came in and they're hosting for the children, and they're teaching people how to run it when they leave. And it's just, they're setting up for the long term because they don't know how long this war is going to last. So, by the way, it's estimated by the UN that in the last video we saw, they estimated that it would hit 3,000 by the end of this year. They're already at 3 million by the end of this year. They're already at 2 million. And they're estimating that by the end of next year, they'll be up to 5.2 million refugees out of Syria, displaced internally and externally. So, back to the war. Looking at Syria, it's a complicated situation. What used to be President Assad and the Syrian Arab Republic, it used to be the government versus the opposition. Eventually, all of the opposition grouped together to form the Free Syrian Army, otherwise known as the FSA. The problem with the FSA is that they have many foreign fighters who are coming in, mostly from Europe, who are choosing to involve themselves because what they see going on in Syria they believe that it's wrong and they believe that Assad needs to step aside. And so what you see are these people who are coming in from other nations fighting with the FSA and defecting to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not directly involved in Syria, but who is involved in Syria? As of this summer, Al-Qaeda released that they have a new front called Al-Nusra, which is the Syrian sect of Al-Qaeda. So these defectors are going to Al-Qaeda, and that's why there's issue with providing military or financial aid to the FSA, because we don't know where that money is going. And this map does show that the FSA and Al-Qaeda are fighting. That's true. They are on the same side, but they are not for each other and they're not supporting each other. So, yeah, what you're seeing here, most of the West support the FSA. Iraq, Iran, Russia, and actually China's not included on this. They're in support of the Assad regime. And that's what you're looking at right now. Israel is not neutral. It's misrepresented on this map. Israel is not neutral. Israel is actually against the Assad regime because, well, for many different reasons, partially because of their issues with the Golan Heights, which is in the south of Syria. There's a big land dispute that's been going on since the 1970s. And likewise, they're not with the FSA and the majority of the West because the FSA still stands for the majority of what is going on in Syria. So they're just against the Assad regime. So, contributing issues. There's a lack of civil rights in Syria, and I feel that that is very obvious by the fact that the government has to protect minorities. Generally, when there's protection of minorities, for instance, you know, the Alawis protecting the Christian minorities and the Palestinian minorities and all of these other people, generally when there's an issue like that is because of a lack of civil rights. There's also an issue with the relinquishing of current power. Assad has said since the beginning of this conflict, or excuse me, the beginning of this war, back when it was still a conflict, that he refuses to give up power, that he was born in Syria, he will die in Syria, and that he was democratically elected, and that he has a right to be in the position that he's in. I'm not arguing that, that's what he says in interviews. So we also need to see the reunification of the country, because what's happening in the country right now, we have people who are you know, fighting for one side of the country, fighting for the other side of the country. The majority of the country is simply trying to survive, but likewise, you have all of these different groups and all these people, you know, who are siding with various groups, and there's no sort of cohesiveness, which is what the FSA attempted to do, but didn't succeed. Also, the media's role and foreign intervention is a big problem because the state media for Syria is controlled. It's controlled by the government. They don't publish anything without their permission. However, foreign media has been publishing against the Assad regime, which obviously pits the majority of the world against them. And regardless of whether or not the Assad regime is right, the fact that it's not a bipartisan media world makes it difficult to give appropriate foreign aid and intervention. Which brings me to aid being provided on political ties. When you've got aid that's provided based on political ties, such as the case with Russia, for instance, Russia sides mostly with Syria because of, for instance, Tartus, the port that we talked about earlier. And in addition to that, they have communist ties left over from the Cold War. So those ties are leading to that intervention being brought in. And similarly, America mostly sides against the Assad regime. When we're talking foreign intervention, we're talking about going in with the FSA. When we're talking about that, part of that reason is because Israel and the Assad regime have a lot of problems. And if you were watching the news over summer, you would have seen they were talking about disarming the nuclear plants in Syria because they were convinced that there were missiles that were going through Hezbollah and into Syria. So, purpose and significance of my project. So again, purpose of my project and the purpose of giving you all that background information is to give you something of an idea of what we're looking at here. The purpose and significance of my project is first and foremost to protect the Syrian people. That's what I set out to do. I realized that as a sophomore at CAC, I'm not really doing that much. So the purpose of my project changed, and I'm now looking at finding steps toward a solution in the Syrian civil war, developing those ideas that will lead toward those negotiations. And so in addition to that, I'm looking to aid in the refugee crisis and aid in the reestablishment of an independent economy, because right now, obviously, with the economy so more or less dead, you know, they're relying on so much foreign aid, they can't support themselves anymore. And so in addition to that, aiding in the rebuilding of the country through potential reforms and new policies. None of these steps can be accomplished without the independence of the Syrian people and with the ceasefire. I mean, really, that's what it comes down to. The fighting needs to end. So this is another image of the refugee camps, and it's just interesting. There are so many different organizations that are working toward the refugee camps. My thesis and proposed steps. I theorized that Bashar al-Assad needs to stop. And that's regardless of whether you're pro-regime or anti-regime. At this point, the fighting's not going to stop without his removal. It doesn't matter whether you think he's a good leader or not. Because at this point, what the opposition is saying is, it's an image issue. It has nothing to do with the actual policies of the government anymore. They're so angry with Bashar and the Assad regime that they can't move past that. Similarly, though, although the opposition does have a leader for the FSA, he won't be productive either. I don't believe that, because especially when I look at Egypt and I see what happened in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood, they elected their president of the Muslim Brotherhood to be president of the state, and he was forcibly removed by the Egyptian military a few months ago, so I don't see that being productive. What they need to do is they need to find someone who is educated and involved with the Syrian people and who's willing to represent the Syrian people and let them represent themselves. And that will be an equitable solution. I'm not saying that we need democracy in Syria, because what I failed to mention to you earlier is if you take a multicultural communications class, you're bound to hear that different isn't wrong. And the fact that they're not democratic isn't wrong. It's just different, especially for that region. When you're looking at a region that doesn't have a foundation in democracy, you can't just stick democracy in there. It's going to fail as soon as you leave, if not before. So that won't work. But there does need to be representation for the people, because that's what led to the Arab Spring in the first place, and that's clearly what the people want. They're working toward it in their own way. In addition, we need to see the unification of policy regarding the handling of Syria, on part by Iran, Russia, and China. Yes, Iraq is a part of it as well, but these are the three main players that we're looking at. We have three main people who are taking it three different ways. Iran is supplying weaponry, Russia is supplying financial aid and political aid, and China's really doing nothing except for vetoing UN resolutions. Which is okay, but they need to work together and realize that we're all fighting for the same goal. They need to work with the West and work with those negotiations before the negotiations can reach the state level in Syria between the opposition and the government forces. We need to get the third-party interventionists to work together. Which is not to say that intervention is going to help, but when you're working on negotiations, obviously you've got multiple players. So, furthermore, though, I hypothesize that America is going to have some problems facilitating that agreement, because generally speaking, we don't see different as being okay. I mean, to an extent we do. Culturally, it's okay, but as far as government goes, everyone needs to be democratic, of course. So, I don't see America being a key player in that. I see that they're going to be looking for leadership from Europe, because Europe seems to have a more open mind to their political system and a better understanding of how it works, especially because of their proximity. And the majority of those refugees are either staying in the Middle East or going to Europe, so they have the resources they need to deal with the situation. Furthermore, in France, I apologize, I don't remember whether or not I told you this. In France last year, they implemented oil embargoes on Syria, and the problem with that is that what really happened was the oil embargoes only affected the economy and the people. It didn't actually affect the government. The intent was to say, you know what, Assad regime, you're not doing the thing for your people. You need to have a more humanitarian approach to this. We're not going to buy any more oil from you until you fix it. The Syrian government didn't have a whole lot of control over that. The opposition wasn't going to stop fighting with them either. The Syrian government, it wasn't a primary concern. Their major export is not oil, and France doesn't buy much oil in the first place. So, when you're looking at places compared to America, so that was ineffective and really only affected, it was ineffective politically and really only affected the economy. And so sanctions like this need to be removed from Syria in order to rebuild the economy and help the people on a humanitarian level. So, in regards to my methods, this is fairly short and straightforward. I chose to contact Syrian people and professors and experts and professionals. That was my goal with this project. I was going to contact them via phone call or email and set up interviews with them, and I will have my interview questions and participation agreement form on the next couple of slides for you. The problem that I ran to with this was that, well, and I'll talk about this more later, but obviously Syria is mostly closed to foreign visitors at this point, and so finding people who have had the real experience over in Syria and who really understood what was going on proved to be difficult. And so really I wound up contacting mostly professors. So, my interview questions, I'll read these to you super fast, but well, it's basically regarding the background information. The rebel forces call for the removal of Bashar al-Assad. Though citizens of the country seem to be divided in support of this, with the fighting, in fact, end if President Assad removed from presidency. And furthermore, does there appear to be anyone who is able to fill the position of presidency? I partially answered that in my own hypothesis. Actually, I answered all of these questions because what I was doing was asking, because this is a social issue and it's a social science issue, I took my theories based on these questions to professors to see whether or not they agreed with me and if we could have a discussion based on them to further my theories or to disprove my theories either way. Furthermore, in March of 2014, new presidential elections are scheduled to take place in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is permitted to run for re-election, and I was curious whether or not this would impact the civil war if it wasn't ended by this point. Additionally, will the FSA and al-Nusra continue to fight following the eventual election or take over by a new president, or will they fade into the background? And lastly, despite the initial coup in Egypt, their government is once again going through changes with a new potential for revolution. Will Syria head down the same road as it attempts to work a democratic system into its government? Which, again, we're not going to see a democracy like what we have here in America, but that's, in essence, what the people, they're working toward representation. So, representation can come in many different forms, but it is a form of democracy. So, this was my interview consent form. By no means am I going to read this to you, but this was I handed this to the professor whom I interviewed, and I asked him to sign it, agreeing that he understood that there was no financial, there's no financial incentive, and that it was purely voluntary, that he gave permission to be recorded either by audio or in writing, and that he understood that the information that I would be allowed to present that. He agreed to be identified by name, by photograph, and he didn't ask that I have him review it or have Professor Johnson or any other person review it. But this was the form that I used, so which actually, and it was very helpful because in sending this to him, there really wasn't any question about what I was doing, so that was good. So this is Dr. Paul Lenz from Northern Arizona University. He is a lecturer and internship coordinator at NAU in the Political and International Affairs Department. He's an expert, actually, in international relations, Middle East politics, comparative politics, and civil military relations. It was a pleasure working with him. He actually explained to me right away that there's very little chance that the civil war is going to end, even given the removal of President Assad, because what we're looking at now, it's really a multiple-sided issue where we've got multiple opposition forces all working toward the removal of Assad, which is fantastic, that they're getting along and they understand that key point right there, but they're not working toward the same ideals, and they have different ideas of what they want to see in a future Syria. So that was the first issue. Furthermore, interestingly enough, Assad has prevented a major catastrophe in Syria by means of avoiding the invasion by the U.S. And in doing so, he actually was able to elevate himself, and he's definitely taken the right step forward, and he's moved up in this conflict. He's got the leading edge now again. Again, it's an issue of perspective, it's an issue of image, and what the Middle East sees America doing when we intervene in their conflicts is not beneficial to the people, generally speaking. And so, again, he gained the support of many people at that point. Dr. Paul Lenz is actually the one who taught me about coercive diplomacy. Again, that's where you're talking about, it's basically threatening and saying, if you do this, we're going to do this. So, don't do this and we won't do this. So, I was talking about that and how the U.S., that's kind of what played into Assad coming and being put back on top, was our coercive diplomacy and our saying, if you use chemical weapons, we're going to come and intervene somehow. Obviously, we didn't seem to have a clear idea of how we were going to do that, and he was able to avoid it through destroying the state's arsenal of chemical weapons. But regardless, Dr. Lenz pointed that out to me. Furthermore, the war has become sectarian. It's no longer an issue of politics. It's no longer an issue of policies. It's an issue of, this is the image that we're looking at, and we don't like Assad here anymore, and he needs to leave. But the fighting has come to be between the Shia and Sunni Muslims again. So, well, the Sunni Muslims and everyone else. So, but it depends on, which perspective you're looking at as well, because when you're looking at the foreign interventionists, there's so many foreign interventionists. You're looking at the European people who are coming in and joining the FSA. You're looking at al-Nusra. We're looking at so many different factions of it. It's no longer